Hey class, in this video I want to finish up our discussion of Cicero and his little text on friendship that we've been looking at. And I want to focus on two themes in today's video. First, sort of ending of a friendship, why a friendship may end and how that should be approached. And then second, the false friend, in particular the false friend that Cicero refers to as the flatterer. And we'll talk a little bit about what flattery is and how it relates to some other things in Cicero's thought that we talked about in class on Monday. Why would a friendship end? Now, remember when we read Aristotle, Aristotle gave a couple different reasons on why one may end a friendship, and Cicero's reasons will be a little different, in part because Cicero has a more narrow conception of what friendship is. Right? So Cicero excludes at the outset the consideration of utility friendships or pleasure friendships as a kind of friendship, right? Because Cicero, the only thing that really counts as friendship is the complete friendship that is based on virtue. Friendship for Cicero is almost a side effect of virtue because virtue is inherently likable, and that is in fact what is likable about a person is their virtues. If that's the case, what would account for the end of a friendship? Well, quite simply, the virtue disappears. Now, how can the virtue disappear? One thing that we should know, and we mentioned this a couple weeks ago, but it'll also come up again at the end of the text, that virtue doesn't disappear with death, because the virtues of a deceased person remain in your mind. You remember their virtues, you remember their good qualities, and so virtues do not disappear with death. Virtue only disappears, according to Cicero, when one ceases to act virtuously. Now, the question is, why would that happen? Here we have to key in on a difference between the way Cicero thinks about virtue and the way Aristotle does. For Aristotle, remember, virtue, and especially moral virtue, is a habit. And habits become deeply ingrained, and they don't therefore change very quickly. In Cicero's case, the habitual element of virtue is not emphasized. Instead, Cicero, and here he's influenced by the Stoic philosophers that he's otherwise fairly critical of, Cicero will tend to emphasize the cognitive aspects of virtue. Virtue for Cicero is a result of reasoning correctly. Virtue would disappear on the Ciceronian scheme when one ceases to reason correctly, and this can happen relatively quickly in a way that, as Aristotle conceives of virtue, it can't. So what happens for Cicero is, if someone's reasoning changes, then their virtues or lack thereof can change as well. So a person who ceases to reason correctly about what's good and valuable in life can very quickly lose their virtue. Now, if this happens, Cicero thinks that the friendship in and of itself just kind of dissolves, right? Because remember, friendship is an effective virtue. If one of the friends ceases to be virtuous, then the friendship has no basis anymore. How then should we end the friendship? Here, Cicero is somewhat delicate, maybe more delicate than Aristotle. For Aristotle, if you're virtuous and your friend becomes vicious, you just cut him off. Cicero, borrowing a phrase from Cato, says that we should unravel the friendship. He thinks that one should slowly and gently let the friendship dissolve, right? Think of the image of like unraveling a thread or untying a knot. It takes a while. We don't just cut it, we untie it. When we're doing this, we should try to avoid conflict with the soon-to-be former friend. Now, this might seem counterintuitive. If I'm virtuous and my friend is becoming vicious, why would I care to avoid conflict with this friend? Why would I want to maintain good but non-friendly relationships with this person? Especially if their vices somehow affected me negatively. Well, Cicero has a simple answer for this. The reason we want to maintain good relationships with our former friends is not for their sake. You want to maintain good relationships with your former friends because it's good for you, not because it's good for them. So Cicero says, and this is in chapter 21, around paragraphs 77 through 79, that nothing is more discreditable than to be at war with one with whom you have lived on intimate terms. That nothing is more bad for you than to be at war, to have a fight with someone who used to be your friend. Now, the word that's getting translated as discreditable is terpius, and it's rooted in that word that I talked about a couple weeks ago, terpe. This is much deeper than just discreditable. The translation's kind of weak. It can mean something like shameful, base, ugly, deformed, just nasty, right? That it's bad for you to be in this situation. Why is it bad for me to be in a state of enmity with someone who was once my friend? Why is it bad for me? Why is it so terpious? Because that will lead other people to think that they may share that same fate if they become my friend. Right? If I gain a reputation as someone who sort of turns against their friends or goes to war against their friends, then it'll be very difficult for me to acquire friends in the future. Right? So that's one reason. The second reason is that to get into those sorts of toxic situations is not in fact good for you. If you allow yourself to get pulled into this war with your former friend, it is only going to pull you down to the level of their vices. That's not how you're going to raise them up to your virtues. Getting involved in these sorts of battles with former friends, not only does it bring you social discredit, but it's also bad for you. It does not make you a better person. It does not make you a happier person. If anything, it just makes things worse for you. So for Cicero, when we break up with our former friends, we want to not fight with them. We want to not talk trash about them, not have all the various things that can happen with the end of a friendship. We want to sort of basically have peace with our former friend, but again, because it's good for us. It's good for us to have good relationships with our former friend. And we're not doing this out of consideration for our friend. Our former friend might not deserve such consideration. And that's why Cicero isn't basing his argument on any consideration you owe your former friend. He's trying to say to us, hey, you don't need to put yourself through that. You should just walk away, maybe say, I wish you luck, have a good life. We can't be friends anymore because the things that you're doing I don't think are virtuous anymore. Good luck. So that's breaking up with your friends. And again, Cicero really thinks that the only reason you would break up with your friend is because they cease to be virtuous. That's really the cause of friendship, and anything else he thinks friendship can survive. So what about false friends? You might say, well, what if I was friends with someone, or I thought I was friends with someone, and then it turned out that they weren't really my friend? That's a different situation entirely. Everything I said before was talking about people that really were your friend, and then things changed. Now we're going to talk about people that never really were your friend, but you thought they were. This situation is what brings Cicero to a discussion of flattery. The flatterer is basically the false friend. If you look at chapter 25, we get a nice description of the difference between friendship and flattery. It is characteristic of true friendship both to give and to receive advice, and on the one hand, to give it with all freedom of speech, but without harshness, and on the other hand, to receive it patiently, but without resentment. So nothing is to be considered a greater bane of friendship than fawning, cajolery, or flattery. For give it as many names as you choose, it deserves to be branded as a vice peculiar to fickle and false-hearted men, who say everything with a view to pleasure and nothing with a view to truth. Cicero gets here the difference between the true friend and the flatterer. Essentially, the difference comes down to that the true friend will tell you the truth, which means when you're not doing as well as you could, the true friend will point that out to you and ask you to do better. The true friend will tell you, hey, The way you were acting the other night, I didn't like that. And if you think about it, you wouldn't like it either. So you need to check yourself and do better. That's the role of a true friend. Likewise, when your friend says that to you, if you are a true friend, you will take that under consideration. You won't get mad. You won't get angry. You won't say, says you, man, because you're both virtuous people trying to be virtuous. And essentially what your friend is doing when they rebuke you is they're trying to coach you up, trying to get you to be the best person you can be. And sometimes that involves pointing out flaws and mistakes. They should do that with kindness. They should do that with gentleness and say, hey, you can do better, not, hey, you're a piece of garbage. The true friend will do it in a sort of a positive way with, I guess, what we might call constructive criticism. But the friend will criticize you. In fact, Cicero thinks that giving and receiving criticism is essential to a true friendship. So if you're friends with someone that you cannot criticize, then you are not really friends. Part of friendship for Cicero is this mutual coaching of each other in virtue. So that brings us to the flatterer. The flatterer does not coach you in virtue. The flatterer tells you that whatever you do is okay. Let's say you got drunk at a party and knocked over a table and ruined everything. The flatterer says, dude, that was hilarious. Instead of, hey, you could have done better. That's not the way you should act. Right? The flatterer always takes your side even when you're wrong. Why, we might say, well, that's what true friendship is. If you're my friend, you always have to have my back. Cicero would say that that person doesn't really have your back, because what they're allowing you to do is seep deeper and deeper into your errors instead of helping you become better. One of the things I do with my kids is I coach their soccer team. And if I'm watching a kid try to do a drill and he's doing it wrong, I don't yell at him and tell him he's a piece of garbage, but I correct him and tell him he can do better and here's how you can do better. If I didn't do that, I wouldn't be a good coach. If I just let them do whatever they want and didn't tell them if they were doing it good or doing it poorly, they wouldn't learn anything and they wouldn't be better. So what happens when someone always takes your side and never tells you what you're doing wrong is you don't get better. And ultimately that person, Cicero would say, is not your friend. Your friend is the person that tells you what you've done wrong and how you can improve it. And again, they don't tell you this in a nasty way or a belittling way, but in a respectful, constructive criticism way. Cicero thinks that if you're a good person, you'll be more concerned about having done something wrong, and that's what will hurt you, than that your friend pointed it out to you. You should be grateful when your friend points it out to you. So the flatterer is an important figure in Cicero's thought, and there's a couple of reasons why. In class on Monday, I talked about the tyrant. The tyrant does not have friends in Cicero's view. The tyrant has flatterers. Because if the tyrant had friends, they would tell the tyrant to stop being a tyrant, right? Stop living that way. Stop acting that way. So the flatterer is in relationship with the tyrant. And we talked about how the tyrant is sort of miserable. And I told you the stories about Dionysius, the tyrant. And remember, Damocles was a flatterer. Damocles was the guy saying, Dionysius, your life is so great. Oh, you're so awesome, Dionysius. And Dionysius, the tyrant, knew he was being flattered and gave him a taste of what life was really like. And they ended up, dangling the sword over his head. The flatterer is the false friend of the tyrant. You can, on the one hand, you could say, Cicero, imagine you have true friends based on virtue, and then false friendships, which are basically these weird relationships between tyrants and flatterers. Now, who in Cicero's day and age does he think is going to be in this tyrant and flatterer side? Julius Caesar and his close supporters. Cicero thinks that if someone would have told Caesar, hey, you're not acting the way you ought to act, then maybe he could have corrected himself and they wouldn't have had to assassinate him. Maybe Rome wouldn't be engulfed in another civil war if, say, Mark Antony had corrected Caesar. But Mark Antony, Cicero would say, was not Caesar's true friend. He was a flatterer. One should always beware of flatterers. One should always be wary of people that tell you that you're right about everything.